Without further ado, I'd like to welcome everyone to this edition of Call to Action. I'm particularly thrilled today to welcome David Bent, who is a very famous artist in the aviation field and known for works in other genres and on other issues. And his partner and wife and muse, can we say, Carole, is that fair? Welcome to you both, Carole and David Bent. And Iain Gray, CBE, Professor Iain Gray, Director of Aerospace at Cranfield University. Hello, Iain. Iain joined Cranfield University in March 2015 after 7 years as the Chief Executive of Innovate UK. He is responsible at Cranfield for all aspects of learning, executive education and research in aerospace for the university and for developing the aerospace strategy across the university group. Prior to this, Iain was Managing Director and General Manager of Airbus UK, whose Bristol operation he joined when it was still part of British Aerospace. And I think we established off air, Iain, that we have a little bit of history too. So anyway, it's great to have you on the show here and to talk about art and innovation. And actually, I wanted to kick off by asking you, all three of you, how COVID-19 has impacted you and your operations. Carole and David, perhaps I could start with you.
Yeah, okay, well, I mean, everything basically came to a very abrupt standstill, and it seemed like everything went into a state of kind of suspended animation. All of our trading kind of suddenly came to an abrupt stop, and all of the plans that I had in place, exhibitions in particular, were immediately cancelled or suspended, you know, which was a great shame. So you know, everything, you know, literally came to a standstill. I mean, me and Carole lived on pickled eggs for a couple of months, and Carole sprayed me down with disinfectant 3 times a day. But what it did do, Nick, it did give me an opportunity to sort of reflect on things, you know, the broader issues of what had actually happened, but also it allowed me to sort of reorganize things for myself. You know, I did quite a lot of archiving through the lockdown process, started to sort of reorganize my business model a little bit, you know, think about, you know, redesign of the website, that type of thing. But also I got straight back into my studio and did some work which was more of a kind of a personal nature. I did a self-portrait for the first time in about 35 years. I did a painting of Carole. I did a painting of the lane on which we live in lockdown. And I also did I started one of my new aviation paintings of the F-35 and the Queen Elizabeth aircraft carrier. So, you know, overall, I was pretty busy just carrying on with my normal work. You know, other than everything else had just like come to a halt.
I mean, we had slightly parallel experiences, I suppose. There were commonalities, but there were also separate things going on. I think I described it in an article at the start as feeling as though you were on an escalator that was running in reverse, because it was as things fell apart. You know, it wasn't just the plans for exhibitions, you know, long-term commitments. It was also, you know, for everybody. I mean, this wasn't just for us, clearly, it was around the world. But, you know, weddings gone, you know, birthday celebrations finished. And so I think right at the start, it felt very disorientating. And I think you've only got one of two things that you do when that happens. You either you let it take you, but you have to at some point stop and go, which way am I going to take this? And oddly for me, I think one of the realizations I had was that, unlike many people, I left corporate life in terms of working in a large organization within the four walls of a large organization. I left that 20 years ago to work independently. And I think I felt that actually not only was I probably in a better situation than many in terms of the, you know, just the pure dynamics of that, but also my understanding that you can survive it, you can actually find different ways to approach things. I'd set up some STEM themed suppers, which I know we'll come on to later on. One of my co-hosts, brilliant co-hosts, was Iain, and they were going brilliantly. And so it was a real sadness to me when I suddenly had to kind of pause. And I thought, if I don't do something with these, I'm actually going to not have the energy to take them forward. They're going to die. And this is too important to do that. So I adapted very quickly, but I also was very keen to try and post encouragement. And so I set something up, you know, that basically every single day I would think of something quite focused. And probably the other thing, just before I'll pass over, was I'm quite claustrophobic. I'm not the world's greatest flyer, although I love aviation. And because I'm claustrophobic, every time I heard the word lockdown, it made me feel very uneasy and smaller and diminished and less, you know, I just didn't like it. It made me feel very tight at a time when you're being told to breathe more. So I decided to word swap it in my head with look up, and consciously look up every time I heard the word lockdown, to substitute it. And I shared this through social media. And what was really lovely was hearing the response, well, other people's response. In some cases, the composer Liz Lane and Belinda, they coalesced and actually did a collaborative new collaboration called Bluebird that created a whole new body of music through that. I was contacted by a firefighter who said that when she came back in to her home after being out, she read it and it really helped her. And so there was something around almost doing things with no idea where they'd land, and actually no agenda for them to land with any one particular person, but just to do something. So I think coming back through it now, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying I've been like Pollyanna through it, because I haven't. You know, there've been times that I felt despairing and sad and all the rest of it. But where possible, I've really tried to do that, and also to find others to help support and to collaborate with. And that's been a big opening for me, is just how important that is for me professionally going forward, is having that opportunity, as well as the work obviously I do with David, is to reboot my own presence as a creative catalyst, but with other like-minded people, because bringing people together through this time has made a difference to me, but I know it's also done that for others. So it's been a mixed blessing.
Well, and I would completely go along with that, and we can come back to that in a little while, Carole and David. The impact of a period of isolation and what that does to an artist. So we'll get back to that. But Iain, I have a son who's at university, and I know how disrupted he's been. How's lockdown and COVID-19 as an experience been for you at Cranfield University?
You know, I'm just listening to what you've just said, Nick, and listening to others. And I'll come back to specifically the university, but I'm just trying to think, for the last 2 decades, people have kind of talked about 2020 as 2020 vision, you know, it's looking ahead. And we started 2020 with such high hopes in terms of where the sector was going, where the university was going. And yeah, it was a culmination of this. 2020 was going to be a great year. Now the university and the aerospace sector have been two of the hardest hit sectors that have been about, and so to do aerospace at the university has kind of been doubly bad. I was involved in a telephone call just the other week with my secretary, and I went back into the office. And I took a picture to send to her, and there's a picture of a calendar on her desk. She ticked every day off. She traditionally ticks every day off, and it's as if the world stopped on March the 23rd. That was the last day to be ticked. That was the last day anybody had been in the university for 6 months. You know, that's it's just been empty. we have managed to continue to teach our students, teach them all online, all those things that everybody said could not be done. Suddenly we found ways of doing them in a matter of 2 to 3 weeks. We moved to 100% online. The aerospace sector, of which we work very closely with, suddenly the discussions we were having about future research topics and things like that dried up. The priorities were elsewhere. Nobody was flying. So we managed to keep a show on the road in terms of students. Students were in the same boat as staff. None of them were expecting COVID to happen, and suddenly there was a kind of working together kind of thing, and it'll be quite interesting now when we start October with a new term where people think, well, you've had 6 months to plan for this. We expect slightly more of you than we did. Everybody was in the same boat back in March when COVID lockdown happened. But we've managed to keep going, and as students, we've managed to give them a reasonably good experience, albeit in a virtual way. But the world has stopped flying, and that has had some big implications on us.
Well, I certainly, Iain, I want to get back to how, you and your position and others in education are having to adapt to the new circumstances, in terms and semesters going forward. So we can do that in a little while. But I wanted to open this conversation up between the three of you in a wider sense. This is about the impact or the relationship between art and innovation, and getting the three of you together to discuss this is deeply interesting. I too am interested in it, because in addition to being a guy steeped in technology, which I love, I'm a writer. So these two things for me are not mutually exclusive. I always believe that they actually deserve more a brighter place in the sunlight, more exposure than they've traditionally had. So, David, let me start with you. I can see behind you, I got a feeling that might be Tempest Past on the wall behind you. And if it is, of course, that touches on the very latest, innovative thinking in the UK aerospace sector, because it is about the Tempest Future Fighter program. Tell me about the influence of aviation on your career, and a little bit about the painting too, while you're at it.
Well, my interest in aviation is, I think, a fairly well-known story now. It comes from my dad was an aviation nutcase of his generation. He knew every aircraft that ever flew the skies. And my brother and myself, when we were youngsters, were taught to be observers. So, by the time I was probably 5 or 6 years old, I could, any aircraft that flew over, I was conditioned to spot it and identify it. I think in my dad's eyes, just in case it was the Germans coming back again. And also my dad was a brilliant aero modeler of his generation. He started the Dover Model Aeroplane Club behind Dover Castle on the old historic flying fields. I used to play on the Blériot Memorial just behind the castle when I was a kid. And my brother and myself used to spend many happy hours chasing the model aircrafts over the, not literally, but over the cliffs of Dover and retrieving them. So, that's where my interest comes from. And it was always a connection that I had with my dad. We then had a combined cadet force at school. I went to an rather old style boys grammar school in Dover, and my brother and myself were both in the air cadets. I flew chipmunks from Manston and caused a certain amount of chaos at various RAF stations on camps across the country. And then my brother went into the Air Force as an aeronautical engineer, and ended up as a wing commander. So I've always had the interest, but it didn't really come out until about sort of 18 years ago now, when a friend of mine asked me to go to the Royal International Air Tattoo one weekend up at Fairford, and it literally kind of like the tap suddenly sort of got switched on, and you know, I've used it as a subject ever since then. I mean, in terms of sort of innovation, and you know, with reference to the sort of painting behind me, which is the first of a triptych about Project Tempest. You know, I deal a lot in shape and form, and I was intrigued a couple of years ago when the Tempest project was launched at the Farnborough Air Show, that they'd gone to the expense of making a full-scale model of it, not fully knowing what actual shape it's going to be when it finally appears for real in the, you know, like the mid-2030s or whenever it's actually going to happen. So I've speculated that it's going to be a triangle of some sorts, and this painting refers to Thomas Newcomen's early steam engine, which pumped the water out of the coal mines and which kick-started the Industrial Revolution. And then the paintings moved through the nuclear age and into the future of quantum computers and sixth generation stuff, whatever that is.
Carole, thank you, David, very much. Carole, I want to get back to you and thoughts on STEM and STEAM, but just hold that thought, because I know it's very close to your heart. Iain, what for you does art represent in terms of mixing it with innovation? You know, many people would say that it doesn't have a place in a technocratic society, but what are your thoughts on that?
Well, you know, I think art and aviation have always been, you know, connected. You look at the works of Leonardo da Vinci, you look at some of the things that went on. Aviation and art have kind of always been together in my mind. But I guess if I'm very personal about it, the thing that got me into aerospace really was Concorde. And is Concorde, you know, what is Concorde? I mean, it is, to my mind, still probably the ultimate design icon. It looks beautiful, it looks pretty, it just looks right. Technologically, it kind of just looks right. And for me, Concorde probably was the thing that made me first appreciate. And it's a debating point as to whether it was made me aware of the role of design or the role of art, because the two things are different, but they sit side by side. But I think what art does is it kind of unleashes the imagination. It kind of makes you think about things in a slightly different way. And you know, it's interesting to hear Dave's story about Tempest and whatever. Engineers, they're trained to you know, use particular methods and processes and analysis and whatever, but something that can stimulate the imagination, allow them to think outside the box in which they have you know, they've been working. Aerospace, from a safety and regulation point of view, is something that always builds on precedent. It builds on what's you know, what's already happened. It's a kind of evolutionary thing. Art, to my mind, allows you to escape that kind of trajectory and jump to a different place and look at things without the constraints of physics, without the constraints of things. I mean, it draws nature in, it draws the abstract in, it just allows you to think about things in a very different way. So yeah, our art, to my mind, has been omnipresent in aviation, but it's that think the unimaginable, and you know, the ability to see the unimaginable and what it might look like. That for me is what it does.
Now, of course, aerospace and defence as a sector is known for the difficulties that it's had in recruiting new talent. You know, a decade ago, I seem to recall that the average age of an aerospace engineer, particularly in the States, was high, kind of mid-50s. And I know that that number has come down, but still the imperative to recruit new talent and retain talent must be a particular concern. And I'm obviously very interested in your thoughts, Iain, and this is before we come back to you on this, Carole, your thoughts on the traditional STEM approach in trying to interest young people in the sector. And then the corollary to that is, if that's not working in the way it should, is there a role for STEAM? In other words, adding an artistic twist to the traditional science, technology, engineering, math, STEM moniker to further invigorate the young minds of people who perhaps are heading for other sectors and not for aerospace and defence at this particular juncture?
So it's an interesting question about STEM, STEAM. I mean, I have been an advocate of STEM for 25 plus years, and you know, the origins of a focus around STEM very much originated from the shortage of people going through school, university, studying physics, maths, the basic sciences, and of course industry was a recipient of people, or potentially the lack of people coming through that traditional STEM route. So it's a massive focus, and in my view, quite right, massive focus on trying to encourage people, young school children, to learn mathematics, to stay involved in the sciences with physics, and you know, the industry still absolutely needs that. The focus on STEM, I think, took away from an acknowledgement of the importance that the arts do have to play in our overall community, and in some respects, for me, it was a bit of an unintended consequence. This focus around trying to encourage people to stay with physics, stay with maths, wasn't something that was to try and detract from the arts, but the way the STEM initiatives have kind of developed, it probably unintentionally steered people away from an appreciation of the role of arts. Now, I think, coming back to this distinction between design and arts, and I see the two things being quite interconnected. I mean, for me, design as a subject is not just about the aesthetics of drawing nice lines. It's about the way of thinking about a problem, the way you define a problem, the way you then take a problem and try and work through solutions. And so this very hard-edged approach to maths and physics, I think one of the unintended consequences was to detract from the role of design thinking in process. So I think it's really important that people do kind of see that. Then the whole societal aspect of arts and is thinking differently. People talk about diversity. You see boards, you see organizations focusing around diversity, predominantly in a gender-specific sense. And aerospace has traditionally been very poor on the gender aspect. But diversity is much more than male and female. Diversity is about different ways about thinking of specific issues, problems. It's around having groups of people that can bounce ideas off each other and not just all groupthink going down the same kind of direction. So I think it's, whilst I don't think the need to encourage people to go through maths and physics has in any way diminished, I think in today's world there's an increased acknowledgement and recognition that it isn't just about the being able to to do calculus. It isn't just about understanding Newton's laws. It is about kind of seeing the broader context of how things fit into society, about understanding the problem that you're trying to resolve. So for me, STEM to STEAM is and this is where there are some detractors of the word STEAM. I don't think the detractors are actually detractors of the notion of the concept of design thinking and arts. I think all they're trying to say is we need focus on getting people to study maths at A level, physics at A level, and anything else we do detracts from that. I think they're missing a huge trick when they say that, because I think you need both. My personal view as an engineer is we still need people to be studying at GCSE and at A level, the maths and the physics, and nothing that I hear takes away from that urgent need. But all those people doing that also need to kind of understand the role that design and arts and interaction with society plays in life and in their future engineering career, which is why I'm now a great supporter of putting this creativity back into STEM, however you articulate it.
Carole, I know this is close to your heart. I know indeed that you gather people together under a sort of STEM to STEAM sort of get together initiative. What are the issues that you see in this domain? Do you think that the STEM to STEAM thing is needed right now to stimulate a new generation, millennials and Generation Z in particular?
I think 2.5 years ago, it was actually after Fairford. We'd had an exhibition at Fairford, and a couple of things happened. One was I was increasingly aware that when I read the words written about David's art, the most poetic words written were not by poets, and we know a few. They were actually written by pilots and engineers and scientists and people in all walks of life, but in particular the pilots and engineers who seemed to express themselves. It seemed to enable them to express themselves in a very different way, where I think some had felt quite constrained in their day job. But when they engaged with the art, it opened up. When we then took the work out from the aerospace sector, out from Farnborough and Dubai Air Show and Fairford and so on, when we took the work out into liberal arts environments, people that normally would never engage with defence, were not interested in aviation engineering, particularly, in some cases were quite anti. There was something about the art, the colour, the imagination, the storytelling of it that connected and bridged the gap. So rather than I was conscious that the work was bringing people together. What happened was I think it was on the back of people's response, but it was also on the back of my background, which is in strategic creativity, and always having to punch in organisations for it to be understood. Design and strategic creativity is having a value at board level. Not as a nice to service element, not as though they're here to do what we buy as bid, but actually that it had a role to play up there, because creativity is about everything we do. It's about how you run a country. It's about how you run a company. And whether or not only a handful of people can write as you do, only a handful of people can do what Iain does, only a handful of people can create art like David, but everybody has creative spark, everybody. And that's my belief. And so what I felt was, having punched in very large blue chip companies, always to go, it's up here, it has a place up here, and then seeing this response, the combination of that is what made me put a question out to say, how do we turn STEM to STEAM? Please add your name in support of this inquiry. And I wasn't trying to do a petition. I was just curious to know if I was the only person thinking this. And it wasn't about, does it really matter to me if it's what the name is? No, it's more important how people behave and what changes in policy and perception. So when you ask the question about, the challenges, Iain's totally right. There are, people that would prefer to stay in silos, or the people that don't like the definition or whatever. But the first shock to me when I put this question out was who added their names in support. And the very first people to add their names in support were not artists. They were people, yes, from the arts, but also from aerospace, defence, education, engineering, climate change, heritage, politics, medicine and science. And in fact, the scientists were the most vociferous about what they felt was missing, and they didn't like being put in the silo either. So when I was asked to do the talk at Cambridge, I tried to explain that, you know, it was, that to me was a revelation. And I'm not the only person on the planet having the conversation. In fact, the Newport, Rhode Island School of Design have been pioneering this since the 90s. But it was timely to bring this back to the fore. And I think it wasn't just that the other sectors rejecting the arts. I think the arts can be guilty sometimes of being a little elitist at times, or feeling, you know, a little exclusive sometimes. And whether it's intentional or not, you know, a child will run into an art gallery and just love it. And an adult will go, is that a radiator or is it a piece of conceptual art? Will I look stupid if I say the wrong thing? You know, and there's a whole thing about what does my art say about me? And there's a whole load of stuff that comes with it. So for me, I felt that actually seeing the breadth of cross-sector interest said there's something in this. So rather than having issues around it, it can have whatever name, but it's more around a mindset that says there's never been a need. And I tell you, if I thought this was important pre-COVID, it's become even more so. That kind of, let's bring cross-sector, intelligent, thoughtful people together with different perspectives. And that's what the gatherings that Iain was one of my the co-hosts that will be continuing, to look at certain topics, but with people that normally wouldn't be in a room together, not the same old. And that's been where the breakthroughs are coming through.
Well, of course, that is one of my favorite topics, which is when you get people from different disciplines into a room together and you put them together. It's a little bit like a kind of oil and water mix, but sometimes you get some fantastic counterintuitive stuff come out. It's that old thing, you know, about the water cooler discussions that you get.
Nick, can I tell you very quickly, one of the things that really struck me at the very first supper, my co-host was the CEO of De La Rowney, the paint people. And one of the guests I'd invited is a guy called Nigel Bradshaw, who you may or may not know, but Air Commodore Nigel Bradshaw, he was responsible for running RF 100 and other things. Great guy. And he was one of the first people who said, STEM is good, but STEAM is even better, because he didn't see it as a competition. It wasn't a competition. But when he was at the first supper, he actually said to me, I feel a bit of a hoax because I'm probably the least creative person here. And I said, no, Nige, when you were dealing with the Ebola crisis over in Sierra Leone, you had the word hope put on a wall. How much more creative in a crisis could you be than to choose to do something like that? And it was just that kind of opening up so that people don't feel they haven't got it. Everybody's got it. It's just how do we support each other to bring it to the fore?
Nick, can I just?
No, do. I had a question for you actually, David, but please come in and then I'll ask you my question
on the same, on the same theme. I mean, I have an example. I call it jump the gap, where I use the example of a circle with a little gap in it, and art is here and science is here, and you can travel all the way around if you like, and you're that far apart, or with a bit of, I was a follower of Edward de Bono, the lateral thinker, and I've also, I personally feed off, to a certain extent, I myself feed off science and technology and engineering, as well as nature and social issues to produce my work. But for me, it's very simple. You just jump the gap, and really the disciplines should be symbiotic. And they should allow each other to express themselves within a context for a particular objective. Why not?
Well, I wanted to ask you, David, obviously the last 6 months have been extraordinary for all industries, but particularly, as Iain was saying earlier, hard hit for the aerospace sector. Yeah. But also we've seen an extraordinary reaction by the aerospace and defense sectors against COVID. In those early days, we saw the sector deploy by manufacturing PPE and respirators and ventilators in a way that perhaps some people would never have imagined before. I wondered whether you had derived any inspiration from any of that as an artist, and whether that might have reflected or might reflect some of your work in the not too distant future.
Well, I'm certainly thinking about it. I mean, clearly for the aviation sector, it's been catastrophic, you know, particularly the civil aviation sector. I'm not so sure about the military aviation sector. But, you know, I think we need to open up to some lessons. I mean, to a certain extent in the lockdown period, it was absolutely blissful. You know, there were very clear environmental benefits. You know, the skies were absolutely beautifully clear. You know, nature rebounded. You know, we had hedgehogs and foxes and badgers and birds galore in the garden. You know, so, but I think, you know, Iain, you know, pre-COVID had already begun to address these environmental issues with aviation and our, you know, you know, I mean, the sort of like the mass tourist issues, you know, but particularly the you know, which feed into the environmental problems that we have across the world. But I think, you know, this is very much for Iain, you know, to sort of come in on those innovations that I know that he is working on. But I'm still kind of like, you know, thinking carefully about how I approach it in terms of, you know, what I actually produce as a consequence. But I'm absolutely certain that I will come up with something fairly soon.
Before Iain, can I just say one really interesting thing that happened a few weeks ago when David was saying, you know, a lot of the exhibitions were cancelled, etc. You know, there was a suspension, but there was still movement within the arts. And actually, on a personal level, we had a new collector come to the studio when it, you know, that was allowed, who bought some originals just a couple of weeks ago, and he said it's because art endures. And there was almost something about wanting to buy something that would live on, because so much of what we assumed would always be the case isn't. But if you've got an original painting or you've got a numbered, you've got something, it's like that remains.
Yeah. Iain mentioned Leonardo Da Vinci, of course, 600 years ago. You know, I would mention within the aerospace industry of the 20th century somebody like Sir Sidney Cam, you know, who's responsible for, you know, Hawker Hurricane, the beautiful Hawker Hunter, and you know, the Harrier jump jet. You know, what a beautiful aircraft the Hunter was, for instance. You know, so.
Well, look, as we move into the final segment of this discussion, I just want to open it up to one final set of thoughts from you all. The call to action initiative that we started at NCW is about, in a sense, it's about all of this. It's about engaging those parts of the aerospace and defense sector that perhaps might not be fully engaged at the moment through action on global challenges, starting with climate change. But as we've seen, going into areas like disease prevention or disease reacting to things like COVID-19 in the way that the aerospace and defense sector has done. Iain, turning to you, I wondered what your thoughts are on engaging more deeply, perhaps, the aerospace and defense sector's creativity by giving it this wider charter, if you like, to go out there and use those sort of untapped parts of its science and technology to go out and solutioneer on a much wider scale, solving some of the planet's, let's face it, extremely pressing problems by using that sort of right brain creativity of the aerospace and defense sector in a way that's not been used hitherto. What do you think about that?
I think it's essential to involve the wider community. Just a couple of quick things. I was out walking at the weekend on Dartmoor, and there was a glider went past. It was a beautiful sight. It was quiet. Flying isn't the problem. Carbon is the problem. Flying is beautiful. And in its own right, it's not a problem. You see the birds and you see the biomimicry and you know, people trying to emulate what birds do. Flying, so I think we need to kind of make it clear, flying in its own right is not the problem. But in the same as we have in other modes of transport, the way that we do fly at the moment is a challenge, and you know, to involve people in a wider creative sense of thinking through, well, what are the problems that we're trying to solve? What are the best solutions? When we had the STEM to STEAM dinner at Cranfield that Carole referred to, one of the guys that was there was an airport planner, and he was I mean, totally inspired by the conversation and thinking, you know, we all gravitate when we talk about the challenges of flight to the airplane. But actually, you know, when you think about how you might design an airport, how you can sort of solve some of the environmental challenges there, you know, those are things you don't need to have a degree in maths or a degree in physics to kind of resolve. You need to be thinking a little bit more laterally about problems. So for me, it is really important that we engage this wider community. I do hold that premise that flying is not the problem, carbon is the problem. And what we need to do is find ways of reducing carbon. That may come by looking at different kinds of aeroplanes. It may come through using alternative fuels like hydrogen or you know, more battery electric. But it also comes by looking at the imagination of how we use aeroplanes, how they fit in the aviation ecosystem. And I think this engagement with the arts, with design, thinking through what's the problem we're trying to solve and thinking about it more laterally, as opposed to the very traditional kind of engineer sitting there with their, you know, the precedent of how we've designed aircraft iteratively over the years, and they can't get off those tram lines. Arts allows us to get off those kind of tram lines and think about the problem differently. That would be my take.
We have, of course, a very issues-led generation out there, you know, one that identifies very strongly, for example, with the likes of Greta Thunberg on issues like climate. You know, and I wondered, you being particularly in the position that you are, Iain, at a major aerospace university and engaging with that younger mindset, is there scope for engaging that part of that generation which identifies so closely with issues like climate and the environment in a more creative way with the aerospace and defense sector? I mean, you've said that aviation is not the issue. It is about getting aviation to fly sustainably. How are you managing that on some levels tinderbox issue?
So I think it is the issue of the day, the whole sustainability, climate change issue, and people are changing their values about what's important to them, what's not important to them, and we need to kind of, you know, we do need to address that. There are some interesting challenges as well. I mean, I was talking to somebody who was really at the very forefront of some of the climate change, anti-aviation issues, who'd flown over from America to see relatives that were over here. And that kind of moment when they thought, actually, you know, there are benefits. I do need to do it. So I think people do want to see the benefits of flying. But we do live in a society now where it is imperative that we start to redress some of those environmental challenges. And I think, you know, one of the other concepts I'm very, very supportive of is the concept of reverse mentoring. So we've always kind of considered it's folk like myself in their kind of latter years of their career, providing mentorship to young people There's no two ways about it. What you suggest, young people providing mentorship back to older generation people in terms of what's important for them and how we shape the world to fulfill their wishes. And I think the arts has a really important role to play in that. That doesn't solve the cumulative experience and knowledge that is required to make things happen. But we all need to talk to each other. It has to be a much more connected world. And I think young people do see both sides of that. So, you know, again, going back to the theme of putting the arts and the creativity into engineering, I think it's engineering that will solve the problems. But I think it's the creative thinking that actually will allow engineers to think a bit differently about what the problem is they're trying to solve, and B, what the potential solutions are.
Well, as we close this session out, I just wanted finally to turn to you, David, and you, Carole, for your thoughts on that same issue. You know, as we have aerospace, you know, rubbing up and in a quite abrasive way against the environment and climate, are there any thoughts, ideas that come out of you, out for you in a creative sense from that, or just trying to, you know, raise awareness about it through art?
I think one of the things that I was struck through if we're talking particularly about the COVID time as well, is I think that it's quite usual to consider the young and not always as usual to consider the elders. And by elders, I mean somebody in their 90s. And one of the things that's really struck me is some of the smartest things I've heard have come from 9-year-olds, but they've also come from 90-year-olds. And so I think that concept of the more we can strip away the identification of whether you're younger or you're whatever, it's bright minds, it's people that actually wish to kind of coalesce around that thing. Now, interesting, one of the first people to sign up to my inquiry was a climate change, a scientist involved in concerned about climate change. And his whole thing was that without the arts, without the openness of mind, or from doctors, without the openness of mind, you can't communicate as well. You know, there was this thing that you can be made too linear, you can be made too small. So I think that my whole thing really around it is that creativity is everywhere, it's everyone's. It's not restricted to one sector or one person, one country. And the more that we can engage strategically and joyfully, actually, the better for all of us. So I see it as having genuine value. But again, I come back to that, you know, for me, when I did the events, I've chosen to have co-hosts or to start now to seek collaborators and affiliations now, because I think that it's only through that. Independently, I can do very little, but it's what you can do when you link with the other people with a spirit that's about what can we all achieve that's positive and pragmatic, you know, and feel inspired and better at the end of it than at the start.
Wonderful. David, any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, I think there's a funding issue that needs to be spoken about, which I'll only just touch on briefly. But you know, large companies, large defence engineering companies, you know, I think they need to open their eyes a little bit now. You know, there needs to be, you know, this kind of Carole's initiative brought to the board tables, and budgets need to be slightly reallocated to integrate, you know, artists into the thinking processes of what Iain's mentioned. So, you know, I think slightly, you know, it needs a shift, but we need to integrate the disciplines.
And I think, sorry, Iain referenced, I think either yourself or Iain referenced, you know, boards and diversity. And I think there is something in that as well about, you know, actually, you know, having diversity is about thought. It isn't, you know, there's lots of different ways to look at it, but having representation in the room. If you don't have a seat at the table, part of my doing the suppers is I didn't have an automatic seat at the table, so I created the table and then created it a number of times with different people to broaden it out. But that's quite tiring to do, but it's something that each thing has begot the next thing. When I asked Dela whether they would, in fact, they asked me how they could support the work. But he also said, I'm a businessman, and I just need to know what are your objectives. And I said to change policy, perceptions, and funding. Because as Iain said, the inadvertent consequence of some of the STEM was it stripped it out of the arts. and actually just opening it back up, not as a nice to have, but as a essential to have, and to have equality of value.
Well, look, thank you, the three of you. I think it's a very good place, an intriguing place to end, actually, because I have found in my own career that storytelling actually has a place in the business environment. Art clearly does. We've established that, and I'm grateful to all three of you for having engaged in this discussion. Iain, David, and Carole, thank you very much indeed to you all.